And this second session is different from the first in that instead of a panel, it is supposed to be a round table, so the papers will be much shorter, only about 10 minutes, and we are hoping then for a lively and active discussion afterwards that brings in all of the speakers together, answering individual questions and hearing from a lot of the audience members. So first, I'd just like to introduce our speakers for the roundtable. Brent Scott began his career as a literary critic, then became an inter-arts critic, then an editor, then a scholarly editor, then a biographer, and now, full circle, a literary critic. He has always been a book collector, though it has come time to de-accession. So just the delightful tone of the bio he submitted is also a good introduction to him. So thank you, Professor Scott. I might also add, just out of responsibility, that he is a professor of English at Muhlenberg College. So, and among many publications is his book, The Sculpted Word, Keats and Francis, the Visual Arts. And I'm just going in order here of listed online rather than at the table. So we have Christopher Miller, who is professor of English at the College of Staten Island, City University of New York. He is the author of The Invention of Evening, Perception and Time in Romantic Poetry, that's from 2006, and Surprise, The Poetics of the Unexpected from Milton to Austen, in 2015. Though he has never devoted an entire monograph to Keats, he wrote a chapter on the poet in his first book, and found himself returning to Keats in his second book, despite its primary focus on prose fiction. More recently, he has published an essay on Keats' lyric forms in John Keats in Context, edited by Michael O'Neill, and out from Cambridge University Press this past July. And James Najarian, next Christopher Miller at our table, to the right, is an associate professor of English at Boston College, where he edits the journal Religion and the Arts. He is the author of Victorian Keats, Manliness, Sexuality, and Desire, and he is currently working on a study of the idea of the minor poet in British literature. His own volume of verse, The Goat Songs, which I'm told will feature a beautiful picture of a goat's face on its front. Seriously. Won the Vassar Miller Prize and is forthcoming from the University of North Texas in spring. Professor Anne Rowland is an associate professor at the University of Kansas, the author of British Romanticism in Childhood, and co-editor with Paul Westover of Transatlantic Literature and Author Love in the 19th Century from Palgrave 2016. She is currently working on a group of late 19th century Boston Keats collectors and readers, examining the role Americans, the idea of America, and the transatlantic circulation of money, manuscripts and artifacts played in the formulation of Keats's reputation and perception. And finally, last but certainly not least, at the end of the table is Suzanne Barnett, an assistant professor of English at Francis Marion University. Her first book, Romantic Paganism, The Politics of Ecstasy in the Shelley Circle, is coming out this fall from Palgrave. She is an associate editor of Romantic Circle's Reviews and Receptions and has published articles on Percy Shelley, John Keats, William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Charlotte Smith in the Keats-Shelley Journal, Essays in Romanticism and Romantic Circles. It's my pleasure to welcome them to the conference. I look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction, and I'd like to thank again the organizers for all their hard work. I'm very honored to be here in such good company. I feel like I should retitle my talk Gerunding Keats. Have you noticed the titles here? Everybody's erasing or constructing or imitating or doing something to Keats. But actually, I do have a different title. I don't want to erase Keats at all. That would be terrible, considering this occasion. It's actually erasing Schultz, a man named Bruno Schultz, a novelist who you'll hear about a little later on. So it's Embracing Schultz, Restoring Keats, A Tree of Codes and Negative Capability. So I've always loved how the manuscript of Keats's negative capability letter is itself negatively capable. It exists in some uncertainty, a little mystery, and more doubt, now to compound matters in digital space, at and not at Harvard. The original is lost, and the letter we have is a copy made by John Jeffrey, Georgiana Keats' second husband. In July 1845, from Kentucky, he transcribed the letter for Monckton Milnes, who was compiling evidence for the first biography of Keats. But as it turned out, Jeffrey did not copy the whole letter, omitting an unknown number of words and lines near the beginning. John Gilmer Speed, writing 38 years later, might have cleared up matters in his American edition of Keats's poems and letters, were he to have done what he promised in his introduction, namely, retranscribe the letter because of Jeffrey's, quote, not very wise discretion in making selections. Gilmer Speed's mother was Emma Keats Speed, a daughter of George Keats, and the letters were still in her possession, or so he claims. But mysteriously, he omits exactly the same lines in his version of the crucial letter as Jeffrey does. Adding uncertainty to doubt is the un-Keatsian precision of Jeffrey's punctuation and the very appearance of the transcript itself. A practicing civil engineer, Jeffrey neatly laid down sentences in blue ink on ruled paper, leveling the bumpy terrain of Keats's manuscript and bulldozing the ragged slope of the poet's loopy hand. Veiled in a textual fog, then, Jeffrey's transcript eerily embodies Keats's famous concept, and also, though unintentionally, predicts the modern art form of erasure, a practice that seeks meaning in absence and loss, in the stripping away of existing texts to reveal alternate narratives. Equal parts homage and sacrilege, erasure violates the host text, but reconsecrates its parts, creating new art from the remains of the old. In this sense, negative capability seems the ideal term to define the essential paradox of this genre's motives. From negation, its operating principle, erasure gives birth to new aesthetic capability. Keats prefigures his most influential idea, that is negative capability, and anticipates its ties to erasure in On Seeing the Elgin Marbles, a copy of which many of you may have. A sonnet that was composed within a day or two of the publication of the 1817 poems, and it didn't make it in. The great challenge Keats faces in this work is how to assimilate the creative spirit of the Parthenon sculptures without being absorbed by the weight of their influence or their medium. He sets out to narrate the psychological and aesthetic effect they have on perceiving consciousness while dramatizing the paralysis threatened by their massive forms. A lot of this has to, or speaks to, the issues of mediation we've just been learning about. In doing so, he careens between the charges of positive and negative capability. We witness here not only the emergence of Keats as a poet, but also a state of emergency that is the perennial crisis of negative capability itself. For its actualization demands not the emergence, but the disappearance of self, indeed its complete annihilation, in, for example, a billiard ball, a sparrow, or a room full of children, all examples from his letters. Confronted now by an array of powerful sculptures, how can the speaker emerge and vanish simultaneously? The sonnet gets off to a slow start. The marbles immediately cast a spell on the speaker that leaves him too weak, sleepy, sick, and defeated. He even confesses it a relief not to assume the duties of Apollo at the sunrise. There's little improvement at the turn, as the statues obscure rather than clarify the speaker's ambitions, creating a feud in his heart and causing him dizzy pain. Yet he still manages to narrate his experience, marching his words over the end lines, pushing forward in spite of the great urge to quit in the face of these wonders. Part of the reason he succeeds is because he transforms the marbles into ideas and marries them with his own dim conceived glories of the brain. He makes the statues light as air, giving them life by transforming them into vital thoughts. At the same time, and I think this is the genius of the poem, he insists on the physical fact of the stones by honoring their battered beauty and the broken images that litter the last two lines. Marble sculpture turns into watercolor as he sketches a billowy mane, a sun, a shadow of a magnitude. In a stunning diminuendo and in slow motion, the poem falls to pieces, propped up only by a scaffolding of dashes. The visual form of the sonnet then enacts and mirrors the corrosive power of old time in its slow erasure of the artworks themselves. Keats performs negative capability by projecting its impulse to annihilation onto the marbles themselves, only to reconcile his own emerging state with their diminished one in the last phrase, quote, a shadow of a magnitude, which of course characterizes them both. The compression of the three distinct pictures that the speaker draws at the end suggests a mindscape with missing elements, parts of a more detailed figurative image that has all but been erased. Which brings us to Jonathan Safran Foer's recent Tree of Codes, a novel literally cut out from its predecessor, Bruno Schulz's Street of Crocodiles, 1934. Foer mobilizes negative capability at the level of the word, slicing out 90% of Schulz's text and sculpting a book which adopts the rude wasting of old time, not as tragedy, but as strategy, as an act of gentle violence or controlled vandalism. I have images of the book, but I don't think they're going to work since I'm here. So I'm just going to sort of flip through the book to you and show you that it is well ventilated. It's as if we took a scalpel to the book and aired it out. So 90% of the original text. But it creates a beautiful effect. Like a verbal replica or shadow of the Parthenon figures, this is a damaged novel, full of ruined sentences, fractured grammar, dangling punctuation, empty spaces, blocked and obscured words. In contrast to Keats's more or less polite deference to the shape of the Petrarchan sonnet, Foer's novel, or better yet, sight, is archaeological and aleatory. Its parsing often contingent upon words and phrases that arise from the future of the narrative through multiple cutouts that resemble sunken windows. Combing through the wreckage of the novel, we encounter a rich semantic layering, a collision of words that sometimes assembles themselves into meaningful refrains, sometimes produce nonsense. Carefully thought out, however, is the book's ontological status as a ruined monument, its negatively capable hybrid form that toggles between book and sculpture, uncertain of its medial identity. Like Keats, who etherealizes the marbles, Foer acknowledges the fragile beauty of such ruin in the fine filigree of his material pages, which resemble nothing so much as lacework or origami. If you touch the book, if you know the book, it has that sort of fine feel that the page becomes like really like lace or like something. You keep wanting to do this and keep flipping through it. And you keep wanting to touch it because it's so interesting. This texture and patterning, the delicate visual architecture of the page, especially given Foer's earlier novel, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, also hints at a darker formal analogy. I'm thinking of the haunting skeletal grid of the Twin Towers after their collapse, buildings erased from New York City's skylines. There's that picture you see of that iconic one of the remaining walls that looks sort of like an old computer printout with all these spaces where the windows were. The novel's central narrative, which we must carefully piece together page by page, sifting through the noise of later language, is spare, poetic, allegorical, and evokes negative capability as mode and motif. The story is told from a young boy's point of view about the family, house, and city in which he lives. It's a coming-of-age tale that traces the slow deterioration of his father, who may have a mental illness, perhaps Alzheimer's, and is described as, quote, scattering into fragments, an older material, a broken exile. And he's not the only one, as we find it hard to hold on to the shape of any coherent character in the book. They keep dissolving and disappearing, turning into masks, shadows, and reflections. As the story progresses, the father is gradually erased, though not without offering a glimmer of Keatsian speculation. He says, how beautiful is forgetting. What relief it would be for the world to lose some of its contents. This psychological as well as sculptural relief responds to the burden of the mystery, the tragic weight of the world's suffering. But it also attacks capability and content. Oh, for a life of shadows rather than of seeing, it says. The Tree of Codes itself turns out to be a partial map of the city in which, quote, only a few streets were marked. This, quote, enormous geometry of emptiness results in the uncertainty, mystery, and doubt of the empty unexplored. The last secret of the Tree of Codes, we learn, quote, is that nothing can ever reach a definite conclusion. The book happily undermines the hero's rite of passage, and rather than building an identity through time and experience, reduces him from the familial authority of an uppercase we to a trembling lowercase I. In his diminished state, he runs out of his house, anxious to lose his way, quote unquote. Shaken into Keatsian consciousness, all he wants is, quote unquote, to be unsure, to remain in a state of flux. By the end, full of ideas and projects, he yearns for a night that would not end. A brilliant definition of negative capability. A night that would not end. In erasing Schultz, Foer ironically restores Keats, and he restores Keats by animating an absence that lies at the heart of negative capability, as Keats does by internalizing the weight and fragmentation of the damaged statues. Foer offers us the tactility of a shredded book, whose ruined pages must be carefully touched and turned, and whose broken words reconstructed through a physical meshwork of windows. And so Foer rips up the book to show its irrelevance in our digital age, while rendering its violated body to offer us its revelation. In the end, and as beautiful meditations on mourning, loss, and suicide, Keats's sonnet and Foer's novel both reveal what I think is the great secret of negative capability, its kinship with elegy. Thank you.
My original plan for my talk was to discuss 4 different poems in tribute to Keats. 2 of them are specifically about eating with Keats from the perspective of middle age or late middle age. One of them is about reading Keats at the age of 59 and looking back at reading Keats at the age of 20. And the final one is about a very young poet writing about a young poet. And then I realized that this is a 10-minute talk, and so I burned my bridge poem, which is about middle age and youth at the same time, a poem by Philip Levine. So here goes. I begin by observing that Keats makes more appearances in other people's poems than any of his romantic contemporaries have, indeed more than most other poets of any period. Post-romantic poems might bear the influence of Wordsworth or Coleridge, but they don't explicitly invoke these predecessors by name or feature them in starring roles. Today I want to pose the question of what animates this Keats love, this desire to welcome Keats the person into a poem. I'll be focusing on a few poems that pay this kind of tribute, but first I would like to offer a summary of the aspects of Keats that primarily appeal to later poets. First, there is, of course, Keats the tragic figure. Ever since Shelley enshrined the legend of a poet killed by the critics, Keats has stood for the misunderstood or neglected artist, one whose greatness would be recognized by later generations. Poets have long been haunted by the prospect of dying before their pens have fully gleaned their teeming brains, and they might well feel chastened by what Keats did manage to achieve before the tender age of 26. He's both a young poet and a poet who never got old. More than one middle-aged male poet has thought about the number of years past that age that they have lived and wondered about the portion of life that remains. There is Keats the humorist, who once lamented in a letter that the Kirkmen of Scotland had, quote, banished puns and laughing and kissing. Notably, most of the poems about Keats that I've encountered attempt some form of humor, possibly Keatsian humor, whether broad or subtle. The internal mandate to be funny seems both to honor Keats's own spirit and to resist the temptation to mawkishness about the poet's sufferings and pointedly brief life. 3, there is the Keats as the working class hero, the Cockney striver, the boy with his nose pressed against the sweet shop window, the apprentice at Guy's Hospital wavering between a life of poetry and a career as a ship's surgeon. If he leads a life of allegory, he's a figure of the striving youth, stubbornly convinced that he would one day take his place among the English poets. There is Keats the letter writer. Poets do not merely allude to Keats's poetry, they often feature him as a character, even as a kind of friend or confidant. Such gestures, I think, are inspired by the genial spirit and companionability of Keats's letters, the playfulness, the offhand aesthetic observations, the candid self-criticism, the vivid weather reports, the jokes and the wordplay, the relish of food and drink, the anecdotes of travel. The sheer vitality of Keats's letters is conveyed in Billy Collins's poem, Keats's Handwriting. Collins, no stranger to literary homages, describes the hallucinatory experience of viewing an original letter behind archival glass and seeing Keats in the act of writing. Quote, "You can almost see the white linen cuff, the dark sleeve and the warm, ruddy hand, as if it were your own, as if your body could fit into his body." Suffice it to say that Collins is not the only poet who has been haunted by Keats's This Living Hand with its trope of vampiric reanimation. There is Keats the traveler. Though Keats never left his native Britain until the final months of his life, he made a rich epistolary record of his travels around England and Scotland, and his poems trace a still wider circuit, through realms of gold to silken Samarkand, across untrodden regions of the brain. In that wandering spirit, poems about Keats either place him in locations that he wrote about, or imagine him in places that he never directly experienced. Amy Clampett wrote a whole sequence of poems about Keats's wanderings called Voyages, homage to John Keats, and many of these directly engage with passages in the poet's letters. Both Clampett and Tom Gunn wrote poems about Keats's chance meeting with Coleridge on Hampstead Heath. Clampett imagines that the handshake with the elder poet left Keats feeling, quote, warmed, while Gunn sees fit to vindicate Keats against Coleridge's description of him as loose and slack. In her poem Scirocco, Joy Graham visits the apartment near the Spanish Steps where Keats died and thinks about the world's endless forces of shaping and erosion. There is Keats the poetic name-dropper. Keats mentions so many other poets in his poems, Homer, Chaucer, Petrarch, Spenser, Chapman, Shakespeare, Byron, Chatterton, that it is a kind of literary karma, you might say, that so many later poets would, in turn, invoke him. There is Keats the gourmand, the poet who wrote in his poems and letters about, among other things, roast beef sandwiches, oatcakes, plums, filberts, honey, wine, cider, whiskey, and syrups tinctured with cinnamon. Today I'll be discussing two poems, as I mentioned, that specifically are about eating with Keats. And finally, there is Keats's name itself. For a poet who loved rhyme and pursued fine phrases like a lover, let us not forget the sheer prosodic appeal of the name John Keats. The two Anglo-Saxon monosyllables so easily fit together that Leigh Hunt combined them into the nickname junkets, in reference to the Queen Mab of Milton's Allegro, who subsists on a diet of junkets, or sweetmeats. Keats's surname alone offers fertile possibilities for rhyme and assonance. The same cannot be said of polysyllabic names like Wordsworth, Byron, Coleridge, or Shelley. Tony Harrison's 1978 poem, A Kumquat for John Keats, offers the titular fruit as a kind of corrective to Joy's grape in the Ode on Melancholy. Keats himself knew that his culinary emblem of initiation told only half the story about the beauty of the world. And this is why he also offered metaphors that convey variegation and complexity. A bee converting nectar to poison, a temple of delight enclosing melancholy's sovereign shrine. But Harrison thinks he's found a better metaphor. The kumquat has what he calls sweet pulp and sour skin. It has, quote, the skin of death that keeps its zest. It has the heavenly flavor of Eden and the astringent tang of the post-lapsarian. And it should probably be eaten whole, or to use Harrison's verb, crunched, with Keatsian gusto, rind, pulp, pips, and all. Keats never tasted a kumquat, much less knew about them, but Harrison suggests that a poet who laid a medieval banquet table with quince and plum and gourd would surely approve of the choice. Beyond soliciting that endorsement, Harrison invites Keats to the table. In his fantasy, Keats is 42 years old, the age that Harrison has just turned, and the two men gorge on a bunch of kumquats together and agree that, quote, this is how a full life ought to feel. The setting is Florida, where Harrison finds himself living at the time of the poem's writing. The joke of displacement is not on Keats alone. Harrison himself, born into a working-class family in Leeds, clearly feels a close kinship with his Cockney predecessor. Keats could only dream of Provençal song and sunburnt mirth, but Harrison, the 20th century Englishman, has the luxury of visiting the warm South, or at least the American version of it. And he exquisitely registers the strangeness of living there. Alligator swampland, grapefruits glowing in moonlight, and sunlight pouring down like juice squeezed from an orange. In keeping with the central theme of the poem and of Keats's ode, Harrison's reverie about kumquats is tinged with pathos. As Harrison notes with a Keatsian mixture of grimness and gaiety, quote, dead men don't eat kumquats or drink wine. They shiver in the arms of Proserpine, not warm in bed beside their Fanny Brawn, nor watch her pick ripe grapefruit in the dawn, as I did. It inevitably strikes Harrison that kumquats are not the only thing that Keats did not experience. More than a century of history has passed since Keats's death and Harrison's birth, and the latter cannot help brooding over that historical gap. Years, he says, like an open crater, gory, grim, with bloody bubbles leering at the rim, a thing no bigger than an urn explodes and ravishes all silence and all odes. There are yet more things in the world besides kumquats that Keats could not have known about: genocides, nuclear weapons, global pollution, and environmental distress. But I think Harrison mentions such things not really to ironize Keats's odes as 19th century relics that are blissfully unaware of the next century's horrors, but rather to use these poems as vessels of sorts into which Harrison can pour his own melancholy preoccupations. Though Harrison's poem directly responds to the Ode on Melancholy, it is not itself an ode. Rather, it's composed in the jaunty, heroic couplets of Keats's early career. In the jingly spirit of Keats's youthful prosody, Harrison mentions Keats's name 10 times in the poem, rhyming the surname Keats with Greets, and, aptly enough, eats. And aside from the piquancy of the Florida fruit, Harrison seems to savor the consonantal concord between Keats and kumquat. The poem ends with an odal gesture, but it pointedly backs away from sublimity. Instead, there is what we might call stoic gratitude. And here's Harrison. Oh, days, my spirit greets the kumquat with the spirit of John Keats. Oh, kumquat, comfort for not dying young. Both sweet and bitter bless the poet's tongue. I burst the whole fruit chilled by morning dew against my palate. Fine for 42. Instead of using the word fine, as Keats did, to denote his own discernment, Harrison pointedly means the word in the modern sense. Just okay, pretty good, or at least not bad. is a colloquial substitution that I think Keats might have appreciated and maybe even laughed at. How have I done? 5 minutes, maybe? I'd better skip actually the other eating poem, which is Galway Cannell's Oatmeal, and I'm just going to go straight to my last poem, right? I need to all right. No, that's it. Okay. Okay, last one. I'm going to just do one more poem here. All right, this is the last one about a young poet writing about a young poet. And this is to John Keats, poet at springtime. I'm not sure still why the appositive poet, right? Why? Anyway, this is a poem by County Cullen. And in this poem, Cullen does not merely address a poetic predecessor. He invokes Keats's full name no less than 6 times in 4 stanzas, beginning with the opening lines, "I cannot hold my peace, John Keats. There never was a spring like this. It is an echo that repeats my last year's song and next year's bliss." Herein lies the paradox. On the one hand, Cullen feels that this springtime and his individual experience of it is unique and special. On the other hand, he knows that this is merely an echo of all past and future springs, just as he is a latecomer to the long poetic tradition of springtime lyrics, just as Keats himself felt belated in his own time. The youthful Keats, who wrote the 1817 poems in Endymion, thus serves as the perfect presiding spirit for Cullen's poem. The sheer repetition of Keats's name risks an air of the ridiculous, or what Keats called the smokable. For Cullen, however, this is precisely the point, I think. The poem, after all, begins with the declaration that the speaker cannot remain silent, cannot control his spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. Holding one's peace is usually a function of tact or discretion, but declaring one's love of springtime hardly seems like a controversial position to take. So we might well wonder what would be holding the poet back in the first place. What is the imposture? And what motivates or sponsors the full-throated declaration? First, it is possible that once Cullen chose to address Keats, the assonance with peace was too delectable to pass up. Indeed, the poem, written in buoyant tetrameter, harks back to the oral effects of Keats's early poems, flaunting polysyllabic rhymes like hover, cover, summons us, tremulous, muster, cluster, and cover, love her. By engaging the tension between silent forbearance and full-throated affirmation, Cullen harks back to the assertive yet bashful spirit of Keats's early poetry. In Sleep and Poetry, for instance, Keats confesses the fear of being charged with overweening poetic ambition, as he asks, "Will not some say that I presumptuously have spoken, that from hastening disgrace were better far to hide my foolish face?" The perils of such exposure are still greater when one is not only a novice poet, but a young African-American writer making his debut in 1925. In his book Color, which he published the year he graduated from NYU, Cullen figuratively shows his face in numerous poems that directly address his identity as an African-American poet. These include now widely anthologized works such as Heritage and Incident. In his poem to Keats, however, Cullen chooses not to identify himself in this way. Rather, he takes his place in a long tradition of poets celebrating the reign of Flora and Old Pan. Yet, within the larger context of the collection, Cullen knows that his poem can never be received as just another springtime poem. He is, as he knows, a Black American poet appropriating a European tradition. Cullen came to admire Keats not through solitary reading alone, but through a decidedly 20th century medium for literary appreciation, a college classroom. At NYU, he took a year-long course on the Romantics taught by Hyder Edward Rollins, who would, of course, go on to edit the 2-volume collection of Keats's letters. We can well imagine Cullen walking around NYU's uptown campus in University Heights, now the site of Bronx Community College, intoxicated by Keats's poetry and the springtime beauty around him. Such an elevated urban oasis would have offered the same kind of pastoral sanctuary that Hampstead Heath did for the London-bred Keats. For Cullen, then, refusing to hold his peace involves several forms of resistance against his own internal doubts about transforming himself from student of poetry to writer of it, against anyone who would deny his claim on canonical poetry, and against those who would insist that Cullen should stay in his lane and write only about race. But rather than defending his own poetic sovereignty, Cullen uses the pretext of defending what he calls the poor, troubled lyric ghost of Keats against an anti-romantic age skeptical of the claims of beauty and truth. John Keats is dead, they say, but I who hear your full insistent cry in bud and blossom, leaf and tree, know John Keats still writes poetry. In this way, Cullen echoes Keats's aphorism that the poetry of earth is never dead, but with a twist. In Keats's metaphor, the poetry of the earth was the endlessly creative vitality of the natural world, but also the world as mediated by Keats's poetry. Cullen's poem is an extended apostrophe to a dead poet, but in more utopian terms, it conceives of Keats as what Helen Bendler has called an invisible listener, an ideal sympathetic companion. This is Cullen. Folks seeing me must think it strange that merely spring should so derange my mind. They do not know that you, John Keats, keep revel with me too. By referring to his springtime love as a kind of derangement, Cullen invokes the trope of inspiration as a furor poeticus, as well as the troubadour archetype of the lover who has been driven to distraction by his mistress. But there is no mistress in Cullen's poem. Only Cullen, Keats, and a generalized they who cannot see the bond between the living and the dead poet. Cullen's biographer, Charles Molesworth, has speculated that Cullen might have harbored homoerotic feelings for certain male friends. If that is the case, then Cullen would have one more socially conditioned reason to hold his peace, and naming Keats as a kind of Whitmanian camerado would be an indirect way of declaring a love that dare not speak its name. Finally, the conflict between the poet's inner life and the external world is reflected in a particularly Keatsian clash of linguistic registers, the demotic word folks and the archaism of keep revel. While the poem begins with a chime of Keats and peace, it closes with a more fitting echo, keep, a word that connotes faithful observation, protection, and persistence. And it strikes me that despite, or rather because of its harshness, the phrase keep revel is a pretty good description of what all of the poems I've been discussing today do in their own ways. Thank you.
Not everybody's got books outside. Imitating Keats, the case of Thomas Hood. In this paper, I'd like to investigate the invocation of imitation, or imitative verse. Though Thomas Hood is not well known today, he was a popular writer in the 19th century, writing comic and serious lyrics, sketches, travelogues, one novel, and poems of social protest like the Song of the Shirt, which is occasionally still anthologized. Thomas Hood's early poems are not just Keatsian. They perform subservience to Keats outlandishly. These poems were originally printed in the London Magazine and collected in what, by 1827, was his first and really only serious collection, The Plea of the Midsummer Fairies. Hood's verse of the plea is, as every apologetic critic has it, weak, derivative, and frankly bad. The volume did not sell well. Hood bought up the remaining copies, as he said, to save it from the butter shops. What is most striking about many of the poems is the way that they not only imitate Keats, they self-consciously call attention to themselves as imitations of Keats. Hood did not have to have, he had extra access to Keats because he married John Hamilton Reynolds' sister. The plea, the title poem, is in modified Spenserian stanzas. It mentions Boccaccio, the source of Keats' Isabella, also in Spenserian stanzas, from the very start, as if Hood wants to invite the reader to make the comparison. The Ode to the Moon not only recalls, but calls out Endymion. Sometimes I watch thee on from steep to steep, timidly lighted by thy vestal torch, till in some Latmian cave I see thee creep to catch the young Endymion asleep. and it's full of lines recognizably taken from the odes. It is too late, or thou shouldn't have my knees. Too late now for the old Ephesian vows. Too late for fondling wine. Casting thy shadow at my feet. I cannot see what shadow at my feet. Likeness to centaur, like Keats' Endymion, Hyperion, or Lamia, takes a fragment of Greek mythology and invents a narrative for it. It is common for Hood to start one of his visionary poems with the dream journey, borrowed, of course, from I Stood Tiptoe in the Other Side. The plea of the Midsummer Fairies starts this way. It has Titania and her band plea for their lives against Time, who is also called Saturn in the poem, until the shade of Shakespeare appears to dispel the god and release the fairies. Written in an irregular Spenserian stanza with lush Keatsian diction, the poem seems to outdo Keats in the Cockney potpourri of classical allusions, fairy lore, and Shakespeare. But nothing can quite beat Hood's Ode Autumn in this game. The poem is so steeped in Keats that one might call it a pastiche. I actually think more correctly a collage of the previous author. It recognizably restations or paraphrases Keats to Autumn, as well as other odes, so that in our context, Hood might well be handed before the dean for plagiarism. I'm not going to read the whole poem, which I've printed out as it appears in the volume of my handout. For the sake of fairness, Hood's Autumn was originally published in the London Magazine, and perhaps in that context, its difficulties might seem less apparent when diluted by the other contributors around it than when surrounded by similarly baffled verses in a single volume. And I have the poem out in front of you, which I have a copy of. There are traces here of almost every poem from Keats' Annus Mirabilis. The Forlorn, taken from the Nightingale Ode, the personification of melancholy, the suggestion of Keatsian bourgeois classicism with the quick mention of the Roman Proserpina and the Greek dryads. Autumn here is an old man rather than Keats' young person. Hood consciously rephrases Keats' Where are the songs of summer with his Where are the songs of summer with the sun? Where are the blooms of summer? Note that Hood backs up from Keats' questioning of autumn to summer, and then gets to repeat nearly the same question of Keats' several times. While Keats' stanzas gently and imperceptibly move us through autumn to the beginnings of winter, Hood's are deeply invested in seeming to move through autumn and then stopping. Of course, these modes are crashingly derivative, and they're probably funnier to a 21st century reader than some of Hood's intentionally comic verse. Derivative is not enough, though. I would argue that poetic weakness, derivativeness, and imitation can be investigated, questioned, and analyzed. There's a lot of imitation Keats in the 19th century, a great deal from the late 19th century. I've argued in the past for its significance as a cultural product. The deeply Keatsian verse of Judd Addington Symonds and Lord Alfred Douglas seized not just Keats' language, but Keats' situation to express, as far as they could, same-sex affection. The Keatsianness of their work, in fact, enabled the expression of these affections and their expression, and perhaps dismissal, as derivative nonsense. Hood's bad Keatsian verse takes, I think, another tactic. Though Hood is constantly repeating Keats, writing on the same subjects in a very similar style, the effect is to prolong Keats's corpus and even his life by continuing his work. His work becomes something like a sequel to Keats, in which Keats' stasis is forever continued, much as some popular serial novelists in the 20th century have their series continued by others after their death. Because Keats's work do not stress narrative, but rather narrative suspension, Hood's work prolongs Keats's stasis, mostly the eternal moments of erotic stasis depicted in the Ode in the Grecian Urn to Psyche, and the moments of sensory near status into Autumn. Hood's work tries to enter into the early poem and keep it going, denying closure. He stretches out the stasis that Keats himself was able to leave behind. The same question asked over and over holds Hood in Keatsian luxury, which seems to be a kind of trap. and Hood cannot give us a punitive answer, certainly not Keats's turn away from them, Keats's think not of them, thou hast thy music too. When Hood has to come to terms with the end of autumn, that it is gone, Hood moves further from mere imitation to absolute copying, not just writing along the same lines as Keats, as at the start of the poem, or rephrasing Keats as the questions do. The central lines of the poem are merely restatements of the earlier ode. The squirrel gloats in his accomplished sport, the ants have brimmed their garners with ripe grain, and honeybees have stored the sweets of summer in their luscious cells, the swallows have all winged across the main. These are obviously the same lines of To Autumn with the nouns and verbs moved around. It is almost as if Hood's relationship with the earlier poem comes to an end. The only way to escape the trap of Keatsian ventriloquism is to introduce the figure of melancholy and jump to another of Keats's odes, but the problem remains the same. We are invited to stay with melancholy, as we are with Keats's mistress, but in Hood's poem, our activity with melancholy is diminished to merely sitting with her. And that's the end of the poem. The poem basically gives up on itself in the next few lines. There is enough of sorrowing and quite enough of bitter fruits the earth doth bear, enough of chilly droppings for her bowl, enough of fear and shadowy despair, and enough, I think, of poetry itself. Hood simply has had enough of this blind alley and calls an end to a situation that he himself started. The speaker of Hood's poem abandons first To Autumn and then the melancholy ode because he has been able to undo the deep acceptance of time's passage and of death of Keats's speakers. The effect is a mere total stasis that is clearly cut off in order not to move through it, through time or through literary history. Hood's imitations of Keats, then, display a more detailed and individual literary historical relationship and problem, and a deeply personal non-solution to that problem. As I will argue, Hood was able to work a different relation to the poet, both primarily materially and poetically, by taking on several strategies. First, through miniaturization and also through editorship, he was able to place unpublished poems of Keats in the only literary annual he edited, in age 29, The Gem, does this very strategically next to his own work. Hood challenges us to suppose that imitation may not be so easily dismissed as you might have thought.
Excuse me for a second, I'm going to stand because I'm weary. I have some media for you. We shall see. I think I need John or Kate. Only thing I have. Is it? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So when can you hear? Good? Thank you. So when I was looking at the topic of Keats's afterlives, I was wondering about the ways in which he's represented in popular culture. I think this was because at the time I was finishing an article for Brian's and Mike's volume on negative capability in popular culture, what he presciently in his last letter calls his posthumous existence. And since cinematic and literary afterlives were already represented in the program, I thought to concentrate on popular music. So what I'm interested in today is how Keats became arguably the iconic representation of Romanticism in popular music in the 1980s. In other words, the emergence of Keats as a pop idol. Now, if we're discussing romantics in popular music, Keats might not be our most obvious choice. In the forthcoming 2-volume collection, Rock and Romanticism, edited by James Rivera, Keats is far outpaced by Wordsworth, both Shelley's, Coleridge, and Blake as influences on modern musicians. Unlike Blake, who provided us with the name of a seminal rock band, The Doors, or Shelley and Byron, each of whom had more of their poems actually set to music, Keats's direct influence on popular music may at first seem less prominent. However, Keats has been identified as a key inspiration on musicians as varied as Mark Bolan from T-Rex, Led Zeppelin, Ray Davies of the Kinks, Jim Morrison of the Doors, and Bob Dylan, where Keats the subject of a study by Christopher Ricks. Some of Keats's appeal to musicians appears to be his early death, or what in his notes for a lecture on Chatterton, Oscar Wilde called the incompleteness of Keats's life. Wilde's first published prose piece was a short essay called The Tomb of Keats, to which he attached the poem Que miserende puer, later revised and retitled The Grave of Keats, with some interesting differences I've given you both here. Wilde called Keats a divine boy and a priest of beauty slain before his time, echoing Shelley and Adonais, where delicate and fragile Keats is a gentle child, a pale flower, fed with true love's tears instead of dew. What Jack Stillinger has called the story of Keats is in full glorious display in both versions of Wilde's tribute. Keats is a martyr to unjust criticism, Lorenzo to Wilde's Isabella. Both Shelley and Byron died young as well, but there's just something about Keats's early death that seems to resonate with musicians. Perhaps because it was popularly ascribed to harsh critics, of being hooted from the stage of life, as Shelley puts it, which I assume is something that musicians all instinctively fear. I found several sources that have erroneously granted Keats entry into the notorious 27 Club of musicians who died at the age of 27, including Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse, even though Keats was, of course, only 25 when he died, and not a musician. But more so than rock and roll, no musical genre has more intriguing links with British Romanticism in general, and Keats in particular, than New Romanticism. That shiny, eccentric subgenre of New Wave that erupted in London and Birmingham between about 1978 and 1982, and ushered in the so-called second British invasion of the 80s. For those in the room who are too young or too cool to remember New Row, here is a primer. In the popular imagination, it was equal parts musical style and gender-bending fashion trend. The music was generally portrayed in the press as a frivolous fantasy, a pendulum swing against punk rock, which was serious music invested in political revolution and hegemonic disruption. New Row was sleek, danceable, and commercial, all chilly synths and drum machines to punk's fiery guitars. The lyrics were often escapist and dreamy, but with a tinge of Cold War era impending doom about the state of the planet. From Adamant's call in Stand and Deliver to throw your safety overboard and join our insect nation, to ABC's thoroughly 80s observation, I've seen the future, I can't afford it. The New Row fashion, their physical presences on stages and screens gained the lion's share of popular mockery. Some visuals for you. Bands like Spandau Ballet, A Flock of Seagulls, Culture Club, and Visage favored androgynous or gender-fluid ensembles that combined Regency fashion, sci-fi futurism, and vast quantities of lipstick and hairspray into extravagant club looks that playfully thumbed noses at gender norms. Immediately following, as New Row did, the explosion of punk in Thatcher's Britain, critics didn't really know what to do with these exotic creatures who preferred lace and velvet to leather and studs, and sang about dreams and clouds instead of rebellion and revolution. Dave Rimmer's 1986 study of New Row was subtitled "Like Punk Never Happened," a phrase that was attributed to Paul Weller of the Jam. And Michael Bracewell has accused New Row of being the triumph of cosmetics and computers over punk's convictions. In The Young Poets, Leigh Hunt refers to Keats as one among the new school of poetry that began with something excessive, like most revolutions, but then mellowed into something more natural and original. If it's a truism that punk is synonymous with rebellion, New Romanticism answers the question of what it looks like when a genre rebels against rebellion itself. So in general, the popular press portrayed the New Romantics as working-class upstarts trilling fruitily about a dreamy aestheticism, while Britain sank into widespread unemployment and industrial waste, as posers who cared more about style than substance while avoiding discussing politics, as lads whose masculinity and musical credentials were equally suspect. This should all sound vaguely familiar to a room full of romanticists, because there is a remarkable similarity between the ways in which New Row was received by contemporary critics and the popular reception of the Cockney poetasters, who were also accused of singing above their stations, of blurring gender lines, and of embracing supposedly indulgent aesthetics over politics. The tag New Romanticism is, as music journalist Rob Sheffield has noted, similar to designations like rockabilly or film noir, or I would argue cockney or satanic, labels that were attached to a genre by antagonistic critics. See, for example, Michael Gamer's identification of Gothic as a similarly tense generic negotiation between authors and readers with massive implications for commercial success and canonization. Excuse me. Just as the Romantic poets didn't explicitly label themselves as such, the New Romantics tended to avoid the label foisted upon them by a skeptical and unfriendly press. One exception was the arch-Nero group Duran Duran, whose first single, Planet Earth, declares, "I heard you making patterns rhyme like some new romantic looking for the TV sound." Duran Duran's invocation of the TV sound is a nod to the fact that Nero and music videos were born at the same time. MTV premiered on August 1st, 1981, only a few months after the global release of Planet Earth. New Romanticism was, from its inception, as much about image as about sound, and this was a prime target of critical scorn. In the very OG romantic music video for Planet Earth, give me a couple screen grabs here, the band appears in a Frankensteinian ice cave hovering on a crystal flat platform above an abyss. They are dressed in what would eventually be the capital L look associated with Nero, outfits that recall the dandy highwaymen of the Regency and portraits of romantic poets. Jodhpurs, ironically Turkish leather sash here, lots of puffy poet shirts or puffy shirts that came to characterize the Nero look and which were famously sported by all of the neo-voters. Duran Duran and the rest of the New Romantics consciously adopted many of the cultural and fashionable trappings of the Romantic period, including gender fluidity. When in 1985, the incredulous working class speaker of Dire Straits' Money for Nothing sneers, "See that little faggot with the earring and the makeup," he was engaging in a long history of bashing the Neros for their flexible gender displays and apparent superficiality. They were boys who wore pearls, who liked girls, who dressed as boys. Genderqueer icon and self-proclaimed celibate human sexual Morrissey, lead singer and primary lyricist for the seminal post-punk band The Smiths, invokes Keats specifically in the 1985 song Cemetery Gates, and I'd like to close today by looking at this moment that exemplifies when John Keats, poet, appears to become John Keats' poster boy for romanticism in popular music. And Kate, this would be the time to kill the live stream for a second because I'm going to play about 10 seconds. Two characters meet in a cemetery, pause to gravely read the stones and meditate for some moments on literature, inspiration, and originality, and then the speaker's interlocutor is exposed as a plagiarist when he tries to pass off a line from Shakespeare's Richard III as his own. Keats and his conveniently alliterative colleague Yeats are described as being on the side of the plagiarist, Wilde is on the other, and according to the final lines of the song, maybe here, Wilde's side wins the day. Keats and Yeats are on your side, but you lose because weird lover Wilde is on mine. Arch-ironist Morrissey is having a bit of fun with the stereotype of romantic originality. Like his idol, Wilde, Morrissey had been accused of borrowing lines of poetry and prose in his songs, which in the case of Morrissey was very true. Almost the entire second verse of this very song is ripped from the dialogue of the 1942 film The Man Who Came to Dinner. Since we started with Morrissey on Keats' grave, I thought I'd sort of come around the bend and give you Morrissey on Wilde's grave. And if I were proficient in Photoshop, I would give you Wilde and Keats on Morrissey's grave. But I'm not. Imagine that. So by pitting Keats against his fervent admirer Wilde, Morrissey may be indulging in a bit of posthumous cruelty, but he's also drawing a distinction between originality and reliance on inspiration. Keats and Yeats represent the former, while Wilde, and by extension Morrissey himself, figure the latter. Cemetery Gates falls in the exact middle of an album called The Queen is Dead, that opens with an image of Queen Elizabeth II being led to the gallows, and ends with the repetition of the line, "Send me the pillow, the one that you dream on, and I'll send you mine." Supremely Keatsian lines in that Keats uses variations of the word dream, something like 125 times in 150 poems. Right? Like Ode on a Grecian Urn, a text with which Morrissey, like any English schoolboy with O-levels, was certainly familiar, the aesthetic and the political coalesce in the cold pastoral of both the English graveyard and the Grecian urn. So why Keats and not, say, Byron as the placeholder for romanticism in the post-punk music of the 1980s? I would argue for a kaleidoscope of reasons that we can discuss. Keats's marginalized working class roots, his famous poetic excess, but most of all the story of Keats, the romance of a martyr taken from life when life and love were new, to return to Wilde, and an artist who is himself forever panting, forever young to subsequent generations.
No, I'll stay here. Okay, so I'd like to give you a sense of Keats' very, very active afterlife in Boston at the turn of the 20th century. And the afterlife that I'll be talking about is not of particular poems of Keats, not of particular ideas of Keats, and often not expressed in writing at all. So a kind of an afterlife that you might talk about under the umbrella heading of author love, what we call author love. And the definition of author love that I tend to fall back on is that of Helen Deutsch from her work on Samuel Johnson. She says, defines author love is a kind of secular religion based on the necessary insufficiency and self-transcending power of the printed text. And I like this because it gets at the extent to which this felt devotion to an author, this imagined persona, this imagined intimacy with him or her as a friend and a beloved companion, is inspired by the reading experience, but also always leads beyond the reading, beyond that reading experience, into other extra textual acts, into acts that are not reading. So the idea that print always sends us beyond itself. Paradoxically, these extra textual, non-reading or after-reading activities often become the only record of evidence that we have of reading itself, especially the reading of non-writers. And so we can begin to trace and reconstruct the effective experience of reading only when readers stop reading and start doing all sorts of other things, sometimes writing, as we've heard here, but also often other very weird things, like some of the things I will touch on. So this leaves the status of reading and text, and in this particular case, the status of what Keats wrote, tenuous and uncertain, which I think is important to stress when we're talking about the notion of poetic afterlives, the topic of this panel, especially if we're interested in crediting the poet and his poems and letters as the model, prompt, or inspiration for the various forms that afterlives may take. And that's an investment that I've struggled with in this project, as I am forced to reckon with all the various ways that these Keats readers in Boston weren't spending all that much time reading Keats. So if there was ever a time and place that Keats enjoyed the sort of cult celebrity status that Jane Austen otherwise seems to have a lock on, it was in Boston in the final decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. His celebrity was indeed impressive. He inspired acts of devotion, commemoration, collection, scholarship, friendship that were central to Boston's literary and artistic scene. And my work is focused on a group of 4 Keats collectors, really given by Parrish's Harvard dissertation. So this is a group that I didn't identify, who are at the core of Boston's literary artistic scene. They called themselves Keats lovers with a hyphen. We would probably call them Keats fans, some of them scholars, but they all knew each other and they alternately collaborated and competed with each other to express their love of Keats. They include, and I'm going to give you kind of a fast overview because of the time constraints. First of all, Louise Imogen Gwinney, a well-respected poet and essayist, and Fred Holland Day, an avant-garde photographer, publisher, and book collector. And these two became fast friends over their love for Keats. Their letters talk about the Keats relics they're exchanging. They're forming bohemian literary societies. They're hosting poetical dinners and staging pageants. And they're celebrating what they call Johnny's Day, twice a year with black armbands, candle lightings, wreaths on busts, things like that. Winnie and Day together organized the 1894 American Memorial to Keats, a service and a dedication of a bust of Keats in the Hampstead Parish Church, still there today. And they enjoyed what they called a pleasant revenge for England's neglect of their, quote, poor Johnny, in knowing that, quote, Jay's first English tribute came from New England. This was the first memorial to Keats on English ground. Very important to them that it came. It was an American-made bust, American money paid for it, Americans made it happen. So those are the two. Amy Lowell is the other one, and she is, we know who Amy Lowell is, poet, essayist, member of the prominent Boston family, amassed an astonishing collection of Keats manuscripts that gave her credentials as a Keats scholar, enabled her to write her biography, and got Harvard started on its extensive Keats collection. And finally, Louis Arthur Holman, a book and print seller who spent over 25 years assembling an illustrative collection of Keats' life, what he called the poor man's collection, in contrast to Day's and Lowell's much more expensive collections. Holman set himself the task of finding an illustration or photograph of every person, place, or thing mentioned in one of Keats's poems or letters, or in fact in anybody else's writing about Keats, or if Keats knew that person. So finding an image for all of these things, which he then cut out, arranged, and mounted on large pieces of paper, also with clips of Keats' text, whatever was relevant, and poems, and little handwritten notes linking the two. It's a kind of a sort of massive scrapbooking extra illustration project, but of course not within the bounds of a book. By the end of his life, he had assembled about 700 of these plates or exhibits. They're about this big. And his collection traveled the transatlantic English world in the 1920s and 30s, exhibited in museums, colleges, museums, libraries in North America and in England. After his death, Harvard bought the Holman collection, essentially a collection of scrap papers held together by glue and arranged on the theme of the life of John Keats. And they paid $1,500 for it, paying $1 for each piece of paper. That's how they made that valuation. So with all of these scrapbooks, relics, photographs, costumes, collections, memorial rights, this project has clearly led me into that wider cultural history of reading called for by Nicola Watson, a study of how literature is consumed, experienced, and projected within the individual reader's life and within a readership more generally. And the quirky, emotionally animated activities of these Keats lovers, most of which took place when they put down and stopped reading their volumes of Keats's poetry, reveal some interesting things about Anglo-American literary culture circa 1900 and what Anne Rigney has called the social life of literature. First of all, the identity formations and social relationships that Keats made possible for Winnie and Day in particular, I believe suggest that Keats played a significant role in the development of American intellectual culture, particularly that on East Coast college campuses such as Harvard, where educational pursuits were treated as occasions for sociability, where indolence was seen as proof of intellectualism and a kind of a British intellectualism, and where literature was the privileged vehicle for experiencing this social intellectual indolence. And there I'm drawing on the work of Elisa Tamarkin, who talks about Harvard culture, but of course it does not have this Keats focus, and so is not tracking how all of these literary societies were reading Keats and evoking Keats as they complained about American capitalism and modernity. Keats also enabled these Americans to stake their full claim to English literature. And here I am thinking about that Hampstead Keats Memorial Project and all the discourse, the fundraising, the press coverage, the speeches made at the service. Their desire was to provide Keats with a memorial, but their desire was also to provide Keats with a memorial stop on the circuit of literary heritage sites traveled mostly by American tourists eager to link their reading experiences to some sort of geographical origin. And so the American Keats Monument demonstrated at the time that English literature was as much an American or transatlantic construction as it was a local product of the British Isles. So the idea that English, transatlantic, the formation of English literature and the role that Americans played in that. And finally, I've been fascinated by the impulse of at least a few of these Keats lovers to take Keats and represent him or remediate him, to represent him in other media. So Gwynne and Gwynne and Amy Lowell, poets, responded to Keats in writing. But Day and Holman repeatedly expressed their desire to illustrate the life and writings of Keats. Now, some of this was a rather conventional impulse to provide pictorial annotations for the people and places mentioned in Keats's writing. So Gwynne and Day made a pilgrimage around England, always on poor John Keats' track. Every time they mentioned Keats, it's usually poor Johnny, is how they described him. They took pictures. They also pursued a couple of less conventional projects. They found there was a young man that they thought looked remarkably like Keats, and they posed him and recreated poses and scenes from Severin's various portraits. And they go back and forth about the two-chair portrait and how we have to keep working on this because he's growing. He's going to change. He's not going to look like Keats for long. All of these photographs have been lost, unfortunately, because much of Day's work was in a fire. So what's interesting about the illustrative impulses underlying Day's and Holman's engagements with Keats, and we've been hearing a little bit about this in these previous comments, is that they were not really interested in the more familiar move of illustrating Keats's poetry, something along the lines of what the pre-Raphaelites engaged in and what many have argued respond to the actual pictorial qualities of Keats's poems themselves. Holman and Day were much more interested in what they called Keats the man, what we can say, the story of Keats. Holman especially wanted to visualize Keats himself. And perhaps one of the most weird but also poignant moments in doing this, going through his stuff at the Houghton, is he was trying to figure out what the physical Keats looked like. And there's a group of index cards, and the top of the index card will say body, and then a quote, he was of small stature, and then that, hunt. And then, so he's assembled all, and there's little cards for each feature of Keats's physicality. So he's trying to illustrate and visualize the man himself. So what I have struggled with repeatedly in this project is thus the extent to which some of these Keats lovers, of course not Lowell, but the other three, can seem remarkably uninterested in the poetry of Keats. So, for example, when debating the inscription for that bust in the Hampstead Church, and Harvard professor Charles Eliot Norton suggests this inscription: "To the ever-living memory of John Keats, this monument is erected by Americans, lovers of his poetry, 1894. Day resists this and revises it. This monument is erected by Americans, his lovers." Because he doesn't want to exclude those Keats lovers who were not primarily lovers of the poetry. It raises so many questions for me. And Holman is inspired. You look at 25 years of 700 plates and all of this work, and you think about this man's devotion to Keats. And then you find that he began that illustrative collection not because of an avid interest in Keats's writing, but because he had done the same with his grandfather's letters and came to feel like he knew his grandfather well and wanted to turn to a more famous figure. Thought about it was purely kind of random landing on Keats. So for all their love of Keats, these Keats fans leave me or us with a question, a variation on a question posed by Andrew Bennett. What were they reading when they were reading Keats, if they were reading Keats much at all? Now, of course, Holman's illustrative exhibits, these scrapbooking plates, ultimately stand, I think, not just as proof of the hours he spent reading Keats, but as what you call a repertoire of reading practice. He wanted to create an archive of Keats, a complete record of Keats's life and pictures. He doesn't succeed, of course, but he does produce a repertoire of reading practice, an embodiment of the gathering, clipping, arranging, pasting, and exhibiting that Holman did as a reader, much like Brian did in his presentation when we saw the screens opening and the scrolling and the clicking, and we saw the hand recording. A repertoire of reading practices that gets kind of staged and embodied. In the case of Holman, that's evidence of reading, but of course a very destructive reading. I was happy to hear the erasure as a good term. What Ellen Gruber-Garvey would call reading and writing with scissors. She works on scrapbooking. What is more, this is reading that turns printed text back into paper scraps and clippings, right? Reading which insists on its material grounds, even as it serves the transcendent, beloved figure of that imagined author that reading is making possible. So in her study of not reading or non-reading, Leah Price asks, what exactly would it mean to study books without privileging reading? And these Boston Keats lovers, I think, force a similar question. What would it mean to study author love and afterlives without privileging the reading of the author?
So, if I can get this a little closer here. I'm not sure if I'll succeed. Anyway, thank you to our panelists for that opening this conversation, all great papers. And so I'd like to hear from those in attendance if there are any questions we can pose with the conversation about Keats's afterlives started. Yes, please.
Well, this is to the panel, I guess, generally. The motifs of erasure and cannibalism and the worship of what? Great. Why Keats? I mean, he had contemporaries. There is a fascination with Byron in his life. Byron really being an 18th century poet. Why not Shelley in the same? And there's enough around Shelley. There's that other kind of Gothic aura, but Keats has moved into in this case, the 21st century. Such postmodern emphasis. Why?
Professor Rowland and Barnett would be here from you about
I would. Do you want to muse out loud? I think that there's something to, I don't know how to, sort of ineffable, but it's very Englishness. It reminds me of, sort of reading Jane Austen and Foxholes. The sort of, but maybe not. I mean, I'm sort of thinking, then why not Wordsworth? Because it gets more English than Wordsworth. But I think there's something, at least, in the context of what I was saying today, in terms of this sort of specific group of this coterie of musicians in the 1980s, there's this sense of Keats is this lost English figure that these sort of disenfranchised working class lads are struggling to regain. Maybe there's some sort of like cultural nostalgia at play. But I mean, I sort of wondered the same thing. It seems to me that there are more obvious figures than Keats as well. I mean, and
Is this something you've been thinking about?
I mean, I can say what I think why Keats in Boston at the turn of the 20th century, but I think part of what I'm resisting or interrogating, and I don't have, so as someone who, my hope would be to turn to Keats and the poetry and find the answers in that, and I guess that's what I'm trying to question and wonder if that's, so I remain, I mean, I have the same question.
A follow-up to Professors Miller and Jordan here. I noticed when you were outlining the various sort of personas, persons, and figures Keats embodies for modern and contemporary poets, that they are, in fact, personas, persons, and figures with a sort of sliding scale, right? So Keats, the tragic figure, is not really a person at all. But Keats, the name dropper, I mean, that's very real. That was the person Keats doing that. So I don't know, could you speak at all to the way the person does get wrapped up with the persona, especially maybe when poets are responding to Keats? I mean, what would you say about the persona of Keats and how writers get attached to him versus the actual person, but still leaving out the writing from that?
Well, I guess part of my point was that the poets are responding not just to the poetry, but Keats of the letters.
Right.
And I guess I would say, maybe back to the question of why Keats, and I was thinking about this because I was making kind of divisive comparisons between Keats and all the other romantics. You know, think about an image from Wordsworth. Name me a few objects from Wordsworth's poetry. Give me some phrases from Wordsworth. Come on, right now. Sure, you could, we're all romanticists, but I can do it so much more easily with Keats. How many poems, if they're not directly about Keats, will channel this or that phrase of Keats's? There's a great poem by Mary Jo Salter called Home Movies, the Sort of Poem. And it makes these allusions to Lord of the Grecian Urn, but it's about the movies. And she describes herself as a child cooking in the kitchen with her mother. She describes herself as a child of silence and slow time. That kind of phrase comes so easily to poets and people creative Keats in a way that I think phrases from Shelley do not. I'm a Keats person more than any other. I mean, I love Wordsworth's poetry, but I think Keats has given us so many objects and visualizable and tangible things to write about. That's my partial.
Would you like to comment regarding imitation? I think is interesting here because it also, as you said, becomes a form of pastiche. But it's a form of pastiche that is very intimately related to the poetry rather than just the persona.
Although I think it's also, since Keats's effects of sound and his topics are so easily grabbed onto in Shelley's intellectualism, that, of course, if you wanted to imitate somebody, I think it would be easier to imitate Keats than Shelley.
Is that partially the phenomenon you're talking about too?
I think so, right? There's more to work with. A recognizable style.
Should we open the floor for the questions? Yes, Morgan.
So I think the Golden Treasury probably plays an important role here because Keats is given a kind of weird prominence of place in that, and I'm sure, I could talk to this a lot more than I could, but about in terms of the way students were receiving Keats, whether curricularly or extracurricularly. But I wanted to tie that observation into the why Keats question. I mean, as professors, especially those of us who are from the 80s, in my day, there's always sort of the dead poet on the walls. It was Jim Morrison in my day, and half the people that had a Doors poster couldn't name a Doors song. Then it became Kurt Cobain, right? And so I think that there is this kind of anthologizing of the life that goes along with the kinds of epigrammatic anthologizing and the sonnets, and there's so there are pieces that are taken out. This Living Hand, what I want to say, kind of presages this, and I think, and Andrew Bennett's onto this, obviously, and others. So I think that there's a kind of mobility to Keatsian phrasing that then ties in with this kind of commodification and appropriation, particularly by maybe undergraduates who have this obsession. So I think, from an American perspective, it's probably tied up with somehow the shifts in curriculum that are happening in the 19th, 20th century, and also, this is going to sound crazy, but like how students were being housed, how they were talking to each other, what the system of their material kind of exchanges about sort of, cool goth culture or whatever you want to talk about it is. So I think that resonates with us, even down to like what's going on in the residence halls today. Maybe.
The Rob Sheffield music journalism book that I read, he has a phrase that says something like, "It's a truth universally acknowledged that girls will always want to talk about Duran Duran." The idea of a cultural identity built around musicians is a particularly teenage thing, I think.
Mm.
So that might also have something to do with that.
Well, if I could, if anyone knows, I wonder if the fact that the known publication that put his poems back into circulation, the fact that that came with letters, and you mentioned the companionable Keats that we get in the letters. So I guess I'm contradicting myself, and so maybe one of my answers to why Keats, and going back to is that because I know that book was, made its way through. So I just wonder if that actually also then got us fixated on the figure and the life and the persona in the ways that we're talking about, because we got those letters and we had with the poems.
I see a hand in the corner here. Yes.
Yeah. I want to actually post question to you. So, I'd like to pose a question to you, so then, because I think that in your presentation, we're going to Keats is on our side, most people Keats and the new romanticism. You spoke about Keats when it comes to how musicians became so obsessed over him. But so why do you believe they only thought of Keats and not Poe or Wordsworth?
I think that's a good question. The sort of cultural shorthand I had in my head when I was initially thinking about this is that punk seems essentially Byronic, goth seems essentially Shelleyan, prog is most definitely Blakean, and there's something of this particular moment of new romanticism, of new wave, is mostly Keatsian. Right, so I don't think that necessarily all musicians fetishize Keats in the way that these particular ones do, but I think it's sort of telling to see which ones do and why, or at least still thinking about it. But this, as I mentioned, the upcoming collection, Rock and Romanticism, has all sorts of different investigations. Keats is very, there's minimal representation. And I should say that was brought to my attention after I started doing this, and I want to get her name right. I think it's Emily Bernard Jackson has a piece entitled "The Semiotics of the Ruffled Shirt," connecting romanticism and new romanticism, that will be coming out in that collection, where she focuses more specifically on the fashion, which I think is both Byronic and Keatsian. But thank you for the question, and I don't think it's necessarily all musicians, but certainly this particular group of them seem to latch on to, like Jonathan, like you were saying, the sort of mystique or the persona. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
So I partly, I guess this is to the whole panel, but specifically to James. I think part of the appropriability of Keats has to do with class. The working class does. It's sort of contradiction to the other, or in this case, contrast to the other poets, right? So he's sort of more appropriable and differently appropriable because of his class. status, and that makes me think also of the sort of charges of derivativeness leveled at Keats himself. So when Hood, and this is something that I'm interested in with contemporary poets also using, he said when Hood is imitating Keats, so like extravagantly, do you think he's also sort of responding to, a sort of Keats's, sort of predilection for or interest in imitation or derivativeness, and I guess this is where it ties into the rest of the panel. I'm thinking of, when you're talking about the way Keats can be cut up in the circulator, so easily quoted, and like when the Seagull's written about, how his sort of feeds into his fragmentability feeds into a culture that can use that. Is this something that you think is Hood like really misusing Keats, or is he seeing something in Keats and amplifying it?
I guess there's, I'm trying to figure out, like, there are various things that we throw into a box called imitation. Some it's like sounds like.
Right.
Sometimes it's doing something like. Sometimes it's stealing. Sometimes it's collage or bricolage, and sometimes it's outdoing. And I think very often Hood is outdoing. Like when he puts all these figures, Shakespearean, Greek, Roman together, it's like in a suburb of Massachusetts was the Virgin Mary with like Disney elves and saints and unicorns around it. In fact, he does more than Keats does, and I think it's a way of overdoing what Keats is already doing. And that's what Keats is doing is a kind of appropriation that's culturally not legal, and Hood just often will just overdo it, do it more.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
When is the publication of Autumn in the London?
It's the book publication 1827, but it's a few years earlier in London.
So, because I'm curious also just sort of like how that would have read. You're saying this, why is he picking Keats? This is like the first thing I earlier. Why is he picking Keats out of all these other poets? But would this also have read? There's a lot in here about, just sort of like the line on the back, like a dim picture of the drowned past. How this might have read sort of as an elegy for all of recently dead romantic poets.
Although I don't think it would have read as, if it's true that not that many people knew Keats, this wouldn't have been nearly as familiar to them in 1827 as to us.
Right.
Except that it's in the London.
It's it's speaking to.
But that's possible people don't remember that. So.
I have a question. It's related, and I think maybe for the whole panel eventually. That has to do with play. It seems to me that as Hood is staging this poem, Autumn, in the London Magazine, there's an element of play involved in all of it, right? Part of it's harsh, part of it's clumsy on purpose, I think. So he's got a very specific audience. Everybody who reads the London is a reader, right? So there is a kind of posthumous play potentially. I'd be really interested in it.
He actually divides his poems during his lifetime into serious and comic.
Yeah.
He's going the serious section.
Yeah.
And then in his first volume, he says minor poems, major poems, as if he's already gotten to the status of canonical romantic. So that would seem to counter that idea to me.
Well, no, and by play I mean just cutting up as well, right?
Oh, okay.
So all of the panels, right? That you're actually cutting up Keats, and you're actually then redeploying it either in Boston or coterie, literally with scissors, or if you're actually cutting out all of the gaps and leaving something behind, some kind of trace. So I'm thinking just play more broadly as a kind of maybe appropriate to think about it to try to figure out how it's being reached.
Any more questions?
There's one back here.
Hi, thank you for all the papers. I keep thinking about the specialness of Keats because there were Shelley societies and then still the Burns fixation and so forth, but as other people have been observing about this fragmentation and reassembly, almost Frankenstein of Keats, I wonder if you could speak to his unique quality being his morbidity, or that's maybe the association. So you think of the reviews of the Monckton Mills often framed in terms of his weird economy and excess, right? Since both localized and dead, and then very, well, aphoristic, right? As a lot of you have been talking about, and I keep thinking about Grant's comment about the elegiac nature of negative capability, but that letter being weirdly from 1817, right? So this notion that he was dying into life all the while gives him a weird continuity and particularity that makes him transportable. So I don't know how you react to that, but it's very stimulating for me. Thanks.
Professor Scott, you have any thoughts on that? I mean, with your
well,
idea?
I think this might tie in with Stanley's comment as well about why Keats.
Yeah.
And maybe this also relates to what Anne was saying about the fetishization of Keats, and the sentimentalizing of Keats. I think so much of this has to do with his prolonged death. And it has to do with the letters that Severn sent back, and the way those letters were circulated, and the portraits he painted of Keats, the portraits of the dying Keats. I mean, his dying just goes on and on and on. And then all the comments, of course, he's living his posthumous life. And so he's already imagining what it is to die and what it is to be buried and have the daisies growing above him and where he wants to be. And so I think this plays a lot into Anne's sense of this coterie of people who, I can't help thinking, too, that they're all very wealthy people. And they have a lot of time on their hands to put together scrapbooks and to travel all over the world and to assemble all these Keatsian fragments and pieces. But I think that must have a lot to do with his appeal, his extended death, and then the body of Keats, the mask of Keats, the life mask, the death mask, all these things together create an industry and a sentimentality. Also, I think, too, the way that Keats, Jonathan was talking a little bit about this, too, about the Golden Treasury. But the other thing about Keats, unlike people like Shelley, I think, and Byron, all the illustrated editions of Keats that come out in the 50s, 60s, 70s, elaborate elephant folios that are beautifully watercolored or engraved or printed and become coffee table books. So they, in some weird way, substitute for the body of Keats. You get these beautiful, florid, gorgeous texts that are
the pre-Raphaelites.
and the pre-Raphaelites as well in terms of their painting,
Which are not read.
which are not read at all.
I actually had to add also, Keats is the nicest guy in English literature. Not that it's much of a context. And you're talking about it's like Tiger Beat, right? He's sexually unthreatened. You don't want your daughter dating Shelley, right? But there's something like appealing and sexually unthreatening about Keats, and especially when you get this weird erotics.
How much of the romance, the real life, I don't know this, someone I'm sure here does, how much would the reading public in, let's say, the 1850s have known about Fanny Braun? And
Very little.
Very little. When does that?
78.
When her letters.
And he manages to get the letters, Fanny Braun's letters, which Lowell tries to get out of them. I mean, that's all described.
But there, that chaste, forbidden romance, or not forbidden, but doomed romance kind of thing, that Tiger Beatness.
It actually hurts his reputation once those letters are read, because they're so
well.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Yes, please.
This really comes back to Anne's thing and what you were just talking about, how wealthy they were. There's another, the Keats of rock is a very different figure from Keats in Boston.
Yeah.
Keats in Boston is John Harvey, or becomes the ground on which you have successive generations of the Harvey Keatsians, enshrining Keats as the perfect undergraduate. I figure he never could have got into Harvard. and it seems to me that there has to be a connection with the grounding prepared in the 19th century and the kind of bardology that was enshrined within the Department of Harvard?
I think, I mean, I would love to be able to track and figure out, and the enshrinement of the Keats Room in the Houghton Library to this day. The history of Keats at Harvard, I think, is really is something I would like to puzzle out. I mean, I will say that they used Keats. Gwynnie and Day were not students at Harvard. Gwynnie had no money. Holman had even less money. Day and Lowell had money. But they were just on the peripheries of the kind of Harvard undergraduate kind of community. And they used Keats and his stance of indolence, diligent indolence, as access to that English, Anglo kind of Harvard, it was, the Harvard indifference, that kind of posturing. At the same time that they really championed his Cockney, I mean, that was also very important to them. So they're dropping H's and doing all of this. They keep, he's always, they're always, so Keats is a remarkably flexible character to him, but I think you're right in that I like that idea very much. Keats as the ultimate, the perfect Harvard undergraduate, and I think you're right. It starts in the 19th century with a lot of these activities.
Well, thank you for all the questions, and thank you to all